Hi, this is Airflo at the Sound Fun 2025. Here is interesting aircraft, RV9 with Rotax engine in it. You can tell the nose is quite long. Who made this happen? This is the Airflo on the Air Camp golf cart with Lockwood Phil. Hi Phil. This year you did a special thing. You put a Rotax engine on the RV9, right?
Yes. Well, we've been working on that for a few years.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So what's the benefit you think it will be for average pilot?
Well, for people that want an RV9, the Rotax 916 firewall forward package actually adds a lot of benefits. So it's lighter, so you get about 80 pounds more useful load because it's about 80 pounds lighter. It's quite a bit faster, significantly faster. If we go to altitude, we can do up to 190 knots in cruise. It's more efficient, so we burn less fuel. It's quieter, it's very smooth, and it has better takeoff and climb, particularly at higher altitudes. So it's a really nice package, very compelling.
How soon is that going to become available? And who shall we contact? Should we contact Lockwood or shall we contact Vans?
Just sell the firewall forward package. So you would buy the RV9 kit from Vans, and it's a stock airframe kit. And then you would buy the firewall forward package for the 916 engine from Lockwood aircraft.
I feel so. If someone already built RV9, can they change it to Rotax engine?
They could. Yes, they could. They could swap it out. If you have an existing RV9 and you want to put the Rotax 916 package on it, you could sell your Lycoming package. There would be somebody, I'm sure, that would want that firewall forward package, and then install the Rotax 916 package.
How challenging is this project been compared to other projects you have done?
Well, it was challenging because the 916 can be difficult to cool. So we had to spend a lot of time and effort into minimizing the cooling drag and making sure we were cooling the engine properly, which we have done. I think we've done a good job at that. But also, aerodynamically, we had to extend the nose out because the engine is lighter. So we had to deal with those issues. In the end, I think we've come up with a really good solution, and the plane flies perfect. So I think we have a great solution. But yeah, it was a challenge, and we've worked on it for quite a few years. Okay. So my name is Phil Lockwood. I run Lockwood Aviation Supply. I started that business about 35 years ago, not far from here in Lake Wales. Now we're in Sebring, where we've been for the last 30 years. We have customers all over the country. We offer Rotax service and support, all levels of service, from basic component overhaul and repair to complete engine overhaul. And we also work on most of the airframes that the engines are installed in. Down in our 22,000 square foot facility in Sebring, Florida. If you haven't been there, we welcome you to come visit. Today I'm going to talk about the Rotax aircraft engine line, specifically the 4-stroke 9 series Rotax engines. And I'll try and leave some time at the end for questions if you guys have any questions that the presentation brings up, or things that I don't, questions that I don't answer. So the 9 series engines are a modern design, although they've been around for 30 years, so they benefit from 30 years of refinement. There's been more than 50,000 of them produced. It's a very lightweight, compact design. In fact, most of the light sport airplanes today are using them. So very fuel efficient, dominant in the LSA industry with approximately 80% market share. It's fair to say that the light sport industry as we know it today probably would not exist if it weren't for the Rotax 9 series engines. With 80% market share, most of those airplanes have been designed around the 9 series engines. Fairly low cost of operation. It's all relative today because everything is expensive, but I think the 912 ULS, for example, at around $22,000 brand new in the box, compared to the price of a Lycoming or Continental, offers an extremely good value. So the 912 80 horse engine with the black valve covers, that came out back around 1989, I believe, is the first school I took on that engine. It has lower compression and it will run on 87 octane auto gas. The next engine to come in the lineup was actually the 914. That was a turbocharged version of the 912 UL. So it was the 80 horsepower engine and the same displacement boosted to produce 115 horsepower or 100 horsepower continuous. That engine had red valve covers. Then came the 912 ULS. The 912 ULS was a 100 horsepower version of the 80. Basically, they increased the displacement, changed the camshaft profile, and they increased the compression. Now, both the 914 and the 912 ULS, as well as the rest of the 9 series line, does need high octane auto gas as a minimum. That's 91 octane US rating AKI. They'll also run on 100 LL or Swift UL94. So after the 912 ULS with the green valve covers came the 912 IS. That was the first of the modern electronically fuel-injected Rotax engines. That's rated at 100 horsepower. It also has green valve covers, and it has that fully redundant electronic fuel injection system. It's not for promotion, but if you see this this page and you go to menu up in the corner, upper left corner here, tap on menu, it'll bring up this screen. Click on services, and then down you'll see where it says technical documentation. Can you guys see my pointer? Kind of there a little bit. Technical documentation, click on that, and then it'll pull up all the manuals and service information that you can get. In this case, there is a new 916 installation manual, and all the engines have a operator's manual, a maintenance manual, and they have an installation manual at the minimum. And again, those manuals have a lot of really good information in them. So let's talk about the spark plugs. Rotax has changed the spark plugs recently. We used to use the NGK spark plugs, and they have now developed their own spark plug. I think NGK is not real happy about their spark plugs being used in aircraft. So Rotax had to develop their own spark plug. It is a very nice plug. It is an improvement over the NGK. It will last twice as long. So the differences you can see pretty plainly in this slide. The new spark plug is a dual electrode spark plug. It comes pre-gapped. It's made specifically for the Rotax engines. You don't ever have to gap it. Whereas the old NGK plugs, they weren't necessarily going to be gapped because they were made for other applications. So you had to make sure that those were gapped properly. Typically, we would gap those to 28 thousandths of an inch. On the new plugs is 31 thousandths to 35 thousandths. So that's the range that we're looking for. Plug life is that 30% limit. You can go 200 hours with unleaded fuel. At that point, they had to be removed, cleaned, and inspected every 100 hours. They're torqued to 177 inch-pounds, and they're gapped to 28 thousandths. And on all the spark plugs, whether you're using the new style or you have some of the old styles left over, you want to use that heat paste on the threads to help transfer heat from the spark plug into the liquid-cooled cylinder head.
What's the gap on it?
Yeah. Yeah, and I haven't seen one get to the point where it was at the max. They wear pretty slowly. But if you were to get to the max, then you would throw it away. You can't re-gap those. Has some paste on it. You can also see that the color of the spark plug is quite good. It's the color of a paper grocery bag, back when we used to be able to get those in the grocery store. That is kind of the ideal color. That tells you that the engine is burning with the right mixture. This is the new style plug. Again, they're factory gapped, and they're at the lower limit when they start of 31 thousandths. You want to use that heat paste on there. Again, it's just like half a pea worth of that white heat paste. We do sell it in little tubes, and I think they have it in the booth in building D if you need some of that. Those get torqued to a different spec, so you want to be careful that you don't mix them up. It's only 142 inch-pounds, which is 16 Newton meters, and that's on a cold engine. Okay, so the engine wants to be cool. You're dealing with aluminum heads. Those can run up to 400 hours on unleaded fuel, either Swift UL 94 or unleaded auto gas. If you're using leaded fuel, then they have to be, they still should be inspected and cleaned every 100 hours, and you've got to, you're going to get 200 hours out of them versus 100 for the old ones. Now, one thing I will caution you on, I don't think I have this in this slide, but some people will go over 100 hours. They'll, yeah, I can get more than 100 hours on my spark plugs if I'm using unleaded fuel. And yeah, you can, but the problem is you'll build up a lot of crust on that spark plug. And when you pull it out, if you go much beyond 100 hours, you might have trouble getting it out because you're going to drag all that carbon that's built up on the plug through the aluminum head. And the problem is you might not be able to get the plug out, or you might ruin the head getting it out. And a cylinder head is a whole lot more expensive than a spark plug. So I would advise you to try and remember not to go more than 100 hours. If you should find, if you're a technician, you're working on an engine, you should find a situation where you're trying to get a spark plug out and it doesn't want to come out, don't force it. You may be able to gently go back and forth, but if it's giving you a lot of trouble, you basically have to pull the head off, clean all the carbon off the inside of the spark plug where it's in the head, and then you'll be able to get it out without damaging the head. Bring it to us and want us to change the plugs, and it's like we can't get them out. So we figured out how to do it. We got to pull the heads. That's that heat compound. So we sell it in little packets. If you're not using a lot of it, that'll actually last quite a while. Or if you want a full tube of it, we also have that available. First 25-hour inspection for a new engine where you want to get that break-in oil out of the engine. You want to check the spark plugs, and you're basically doing almost everything that a 100-hour inspection would involve. That's kind of important on a brand new engine installation at that 25 hours to really check everything, make sure you're not getting any excessive amounts of metal in the oil on the magnetic plug. Make sure that there are no hoses rubbing, that everything looks really good inside the engine installation. Check the spark plugs, make sure it's burning properly. So all those things are things that we want you to check at the 25-hour point. The 50 is optional. To be honest, not many people do that. And then you're into the 100-hour intervals. Back up one. And so it's pretty straightforward, but I would advise you to go ahead and look in those manuals, and they'll tell you exactly what you need to do, when you need to do it. It's all tied to the whether you're using leaded fuel more than 30% of the time. A case where that plug was in there a long time, you can see how the crud will build up on the spark plug. And again, if you leave them in there too long, you'll damage the head trying to get them out. The new spark plugs, they do recommend that you use the right tool to pull the caps off, because the caps are very aggressive. They really grab onto that spark plug pretty hard. And so it's a great idea if you can get the right tool. Think of this, it's kind of in this picture here, that allows you to pull it straight off. If you're pulling it, if you're forcing it at an angle, you can break the porcelain on the plug, and the plugs are not cheap, so you don't want to do that. So let's talk about oil on these engines a little bit. The Aeroshell Sport Plus 4 has been around for a while. Aeroshell did develop this oil just for the 9 Series Rotax engines. It's a great product. We're happy to have it. One of the big differences between this and regular automotive oil is that it's got a lot of zinc and phosphorus. It's a combination that they call ZDDP. And that really protects the camshaft and the lifters. because we don't have roller lifters. So our lifters are riding right on the camshaft metal to metal. So we need that product. Now that used to be in automotive oil back in the 60s before they came out with unleaded gas and catalytic converters. The reason they had to take it out of the automotive gas oil was because little trace amounts of it will end up being burnt, go through the exhaust, and they will destroy the catalytic converter. But we don't have a catalytic converter, so we can have those products in there. They've even taken it out of a lot of the new motorcycle oils because I think they have catalytic converters as well now. So it's a special product. It does work really well, and I would advise you to use one of the two oils I'm going to show you versus something else which was not made specifically for these engines. Work with leaded avgas 100LL, and that's a real trick. I have talked to a number of people who have been using it with 100LL, and they are very impressed with how well it works at carrying the lead. I think it probably does a better job than the Airflo, which is a blend, which is amazing. So they've found some special chemistry there that enables them to do that. As far as which oil to use, I would say if you're running a turbocharged Rotax engine, you would benefit greatly from switching to the XPS because of the full synthetic and the higher heat, higher temperature capability of that oil. Your turbocharger is going to benefit. So 914, 915, 916 IS, those engines should really be running on the XPS now that it's available. If you're running a normally aspirated 912 IS, 912 UL, 912 ULS, the regular Airflo is fine. Although we do see some benefits if you're running 100LL to the new XPS. So 100-hour oil change intervals are possible with 100 with unleaded fuel. Now the unleaded fuel is available in different forms. You've got auto gas, 91 octane or higher for most of the engines, or the Swift UL94. There are some new fuels coming out. Swift is coming out with a new 100R, which we're hoping is going to be a drop-in replacement. And they're actually blending that now. And we're hoping that Rotax is going to run a test on that soon. And so we're waiting to see how that works out for us.
Like 93 octane ethanol free versus 91.
Well, the ethanol free. I can't talk this morning. I didn't get any coffee this morning, man. Tell you what. So the ethanol free, there are some benefits to it, and it's not as aggressive on the fuel tanks, a lot of the sealants and the fuel tank materials. But all in all, it still has to meet the modern emissions, and so it still has some of the same drawbacks that all the auto gases have. The higher the octane, the less likely you're going to get detonation. If your temperatures are within the ranges that Rotax gives you for limits, the 91 will do the trick. If you were to go outside of one of those limitations or like over boost in one of the turbos, then the higher the octane, the better.
Florida, 87, 89, 93. You don't really see a lot of 93. But we got a lot of voters who buy. In fact, I buy mine at the Murphy gas station because they sell 93 octane.
Yeah, 93 is fine.
Right, I'm just saying. 91, I have, it's hard time finding 91.
Any Wawa has it. 87, they'll have 89, they'll have 91, they'll have 93. Yeah, and if you go to higher elevations, like you go out west, they won't bother with the 93 because nobody's engine's putting out the power for it, right? And a lot of cars, like even BMW, most of their cars, they say 91 octane or higher is good enough. So but there's nothing wrong with 93. If that's what you can get, use it, it's fine. Is that it's a dry sump engine. That means that we have a separate oil tank and we don't pull the oil in the bottom of the crankcase like you would in a typical Lycoming or Continental. And that allows the engine to be packaged with a little bit more flexibility, right? The engine's more compact, the crankcase is very tight to the engine, and all that oil is going to be in the tank. And the designer has a choice where they're going to put that oil tank. You also get a little more cooling on the oil tank, depending on how much air you have blowing on it. But with the oil tank being separate, It's a fairly thin stainless steel, so you're going to get some cooling with the oil in the tank. It allows us to have a smaller quantity of oil because the oil tank is ideally shaped, tall and skinny, with the draw tube in the very bottom of the tank, so that we can assure that you're going to get oil at a wide variety of angle of attack. And so we typically only have about 3 quarts in the system, which helps keep the engine lighter, better for the environment. We're only using 3 quarts of oil, and of course it saves on oil change costs. I don't know if you can see my pointer there, but that's the draw tube that actually draws the oil, and that's down in the bottom of the tank. And then here in the center you can see an oil screen, and then on the outside edge is the return line. So the oil from the engine is being returned between the screen and the outer portion of the tank. And so if there is any metal or bubbles, and there will be air bubbles in the oil that's being returned, that screen will break up the bubbles, and it will stop any metal that might be in the oil from any large pieces from getting into the center area. And the center area is where the draw tube is, and you're drawing your oil up. Again, that screen also is important to break up any bubbles in the oil so that you're getting pure unaerated oil into the engine. Here's a side shot. It's kind of dramatic in that it shows you what might happen if you hook the lines up incorrectly. So if you put your feed line and you hook that up to what is the return fitting, the typical oil level in the tank is right about here. You're just going to be drawing air, and so you're going to ruin the engine, right? So don't do that. Make sure that you get it on the out. There'll be an out and there'll be an in. And then this little fitting up here is your vent line. The way these engines operate, every piston engine has to have some venting in the crankcase. And ours is no different. Even though the tolerances are very tight and we have very little blow-by, we still have some blow-by. So whenever there's a combustion event in one of your 4 cylinders, some of the gases will get by the rings into the crankcase. They're going to pressurize the crankcase, and that gas has to go somewhere. The way we get rid of it in the Rotax is we use it to push the hot oil back to the oil tank. So you're going to have fittings on the bottom of your engine. As that gas pressurizes the crankcase, it pushes that oil back to the oil tank. And so you're going to get a blob of oil, a blob of air, a blob of oil, a blob of air. When you burp the engine, which a lot of people talk about when it's cold, what you're doing by pulling the prop through is you're creating some blow-by. Because even though you're not getting as much combustion or pressure in the combustion chamber as when the engine's running, you're still creating compression, and some of that is getting by the rings, and you're still putting pressure into the crankcase. You're pushing the oil in the crankcase back to the tank, and when you hear a gurgle, that means most of the oil is back, and now the air is getting to the tank. So that little vent line there is the vent for the crankcase, in essence. So as that air, hot air, goes into the oil tank, it escapes through that vent line. So 3 dipsticks here. The one on the right is the original dipstick that we had way back when. Rotax has since decided to raise the level of oil that they recommend keeping in the oil tank. You can see the flat section of that dipstick is where the oil level should be in normal operation. So what they did was they raised the level up and they tightened the range that they want you to use. It would be very unusual for you to ever need to add more than half a liter at a time. Typically, when I'm adding oil, I'll put 1/4 of a liter in at a time, and see how that looks. Where people, you got to burp the engine before each flight. That's not really a thing. You don't have to burp the engine before each flight. I check the oil level, and if it's anywhere in the flat zone, you can go fly. The problem is if it's below the flat, now you know your oil level may be low, and now you got to check. So that's when you're going to burp the engine, check the oil level, make sure it's in the flat range. And of course, if you're going on a long cross country or something, flying from here to Oshkosh, maybe you want to have it pretty full. And in that case, again, you want to burp it first. But no, I usually check it before each flight. I mean, you get to know your engine, you know how much it uses. It's not uncommon for a normally aspirated 9 series to use not more than 1 quart, and between 150 and 100 hours, it might use 1 quart. So they don't use very much. The turbocharged engines will use more. The reason I have this shot is if you look at that dipstick on the very left, it's a little different from the others, and it's not, the top tab that you grab onto is not closed up enough, which means when you go to drop that in, it might hang up. So right here in this picture, you can see where that dipstick is actually hanging up in the top of the tank, and it's not going down all the way. You have to be careful if you have one that's made like that. You can usually push them down, but if you just drop it in, it may not go down all the way, which means you may be putting too much oil in your tank because your level is effectively raised up. So if you get one, make sure that yours does go down all the way. And sometimes the hole that it's sitting in is not even cut perfectly round. So I've seen them where they'll go in at one angle, you turn them 90 degrees, and they won't go in. So you need to be aware of that so it doesn't catch you off guard. What Rotax did was they decided that, you know what, coolant temperature is probably more important than cylinder head temperature because it's a lower maximum. 248 degrees Fahrenheit is the max, whereas on the cylinder head, most of them are 275. So it could be possible that you could exceed your maximum coolant temp without exceeding the maximum cylinder head temp. So on the newer engines, on the right picture there, they switched, and now they're reading in the top of the cylinder, right at the exhaust port, which is the hottest point of the coolant, what the coolant temperature is. So the point is, if you swap engines, if you have an older airplane and you have one of these engines like the one on the left and you swap to a new engine, you're going to need to recalibrate your instruments. And so they'll probably be showing 275 as the limit, and now you're reading coolant temp, it's going to be 248. So you need to make sure your instruments are changed to match that. We can't get those old cylinder heads anymore. So if you overheat a cylinder head and you have to change it, you'll have to put the new style on. If it happens to be the one that has your cylinder head temp probe on it, you'll also have to change over and realize that now you're reading coolant temp instead. The heads are compatible, so you can just change one head to a new style. It's not the carburetor. We took the float bowl and dropped it off. You can see the float on the right is clearly a lot heavier than the one on the left. And those are floats that probably were made at the same time, installed at the same time. One absorbed fuel and one didn't. And that's what we see. So this would be a way I would do a quick field check if I had a problem, the engine was exhibiting a problem that could be related to heavy floats. I could drop the float ball. I don't have a gram scale with me, but I can see if both the floats are floating to where the top of the float is even with the rim of the bowl, like the one on the left, it's probably pretty good. If it's sinking, it's going to look like the one on the right, and it's going to drop down into the fuel. I mean, I've seen them where they sit on the bottom. They just sink right to the bottom of the float bowl. But if it's working correctly, the little brass pin that comes out of the center of the float that the float arm rides on to shut the fuel off and meter the flow of fuel into the float bowl, which, back that up, is right here. You'll see that kind of piercing the fuel level. So it'll be sitting there floating, not above, but not below, but it'll be piercing the fuel level, whereas the heavy one will be completely under the fuel level. That they be checked with a vacuum gauge. It's critical that they are balanced perfectly. If you have one carburetor where the throttle is slightly more advanced than the other one, and I'm talking thousandths of an inch on you can't measure it mechanically. You need to use vacuum gauges to make sure you're getting it right. Then you're going to find that one set of cylinders is going to be firing a little harder than the other, and it's going to create excess torsional vibration where the crank is, boom, is kicking harder, less, harder, less, and those two banks of cylinders are going to fight each other, and the gearbox is going to take a hit.
The dark.
There you go. All right, you're welcome. It is a pretty ideal idle for a carbureted 9 series engine. It's you can idle up to 1800. If you go over 1800, what you're going to find is you're probably going to have little bit hard time landing. You're going to be riding the brakes when you're taxiing, and your choke won't work. Because the choke on these engines is not really a choke, it's an enrichening circuit. And it relies on the butterfly valve, which is how you're throttling the engine, to be almost totally closed. So if your idle is set too high, the butterfly isn't quite closed enough, and the choke circuit isn't really going to deliver the right amount of fuel. And along the same line of thinking, you need to have the throttle all the way at idle if you're starting a carbureted Rotax engine in cold weather, and you want that choke circuit to work, because you want the butterfly as closed as you can get it. And it's almost all the way closed at idle, but there's a little bit, letting a little bit of air through. And that's why that carb sync is so critical, particularly at idle. Not as much at wide open throttle, because if your butterfly is horizontal, whether one's a little different from the other, the engine's not going to know. But when it's at idle, they're really almost closed. In fact, if you let the idle go much below 1400, it will close all the way and the engine will shut off. And that's the main reason we don't want you going below 1400. I do hear stories of people saying my engine quit on short final, and otherwise, and it started right up after that, and it seemed to be running fine. I don't know what happened. It's almost always because the idle was set too low, or they don't have a good stop in their throttle quadrant, and they're flexing the stops on the carburetor, and they're shutting the car. Usually it's not a problem because they were high, and that's why they were pulling so hard on the throttle lever, trying to get some magical braking power, right? And they shut the engine off. So just be careful about that. Make sure your idle doesn't go too low, and try and make sure that you have some kind of a good throttle stop. Prices are typically 100 LL, which is a good product, and it's available at most airports across the country, many airports. Automotive gasoline, also called MoGas, and Swift UL94. Those are the options that you see out there right now. Let's talk about avgas first. So avgas is a fuel that is blended specifically for aviation use. One of the things that makes it really good for aviation use is it has very low volatility. So it was engineered and blended to sit and live in a vented fuel tank. I think that low lead is a bit of a misnomer. Like my kids would say when they were little, it should be a lot of lead. A lot of lead, Dad. It's got as much as 18 times as much tetraethyl lead as autogas had back in the 60s. So it is quite a bit of lead. Well, that was put in there to help them raise the octane and also protect the valves in the older Lycoming Continental and other engines that did not have hardened valve seats. They needed that lead to stop metal transfer between the valve seat and the valve itself. Taxes. You build up a lot of lead in the oil, the lead starts building up in the passageways. Typically, it particularly does not like the base stock that's used to make synthetic oils. Somehow XPS has managed to break through that barrier and make a full synthetic oil that is compatible with 100 LL. If you remember, maybe 20 years ago, when Mobil 1 had a special oil they came out with for aviation, and then they started finding they were having big lead paste problems, and they pulled it off the market. That was because the base stock that they used turned out to be not compatible with 100 LL. This is a sprag clutch assembly. It's that little clutch that allows the engine to start, so that the starter actually engages with the sprag clutch, which will override when you're not using the starter, which is kind of a cool deal, because if you stay on the starter after the engine starts, you don't hurt anything. You don't have a Bendix, and it won't hang up. But if it gets too much lead in it, it might not work properly. If I'm using avgas a lot on a cross country, then I will probably be adding the Decalin to my fuel tanks. One of the things that I forgot to mention about 100 LL is it's a good choice for the last fill up of the year. So if you live up north, you're in a cold climate, you kind of park your airplane for quite a few months in the winter, and you want to make sure your fuel is going to be good in the spring and your carburetors aren't going to be gummed up, then avgas is a good choice. Put avgas in the tank before you put the plane to bed, and make sure you run it to get it in the carburetors, because if you have auto gas in your carburetors and you put avgas in your tank, but you don't run it and get it in the carburetors are still going to get messed up. It's of avgas, low volatility, engineered and blended to live in a vented fuel tank, good at high temperatures, good at low pressures, no lead. So all the benefits of avgas with none of the negative sides, because no lead. Plenty of octane for us. It's a MON rating of 94, which would be a AKI rating of like 97. So if you compare it to auto gas, it's really high, but not as high as 100 LL. Lead free, and problem is limited availability with the Swift. Let's talk about auto gas. Auto gas is available all across the country. Every town has a gas station. Usually you can get the different octanes that you need. So it's less expensive than avgas. Unleaded formula allows for extended oil change intervals and longer spark plug life. Unleaded fuel is better for the environment. It's readily available in every town. So those are all the pluses of avgas. Disadvantages: much higher volatility. The formulation can lead to rapid deterioration when stored in a vented tank. And it has aggressive solvent-like properties that can damage some fuel systems. I know that if I spill auto gas on the hangar floor in my shop, it eats the paint off the floor. If I spill avgas on the floor, it just cleans it. You just wipe it up and you got a clean spot. You know, it's definitely not as aggressive a solvent. And then the tank builds a certain amount of pressure, which is enough, much more than ambient, to stop the transfer of liquid to gaseous state taking place, so the fuel stays stable. If it were to get to a dangerous level, then there's a valve, a relief valve in your tank that will let the extra pressure off. But normally it's under pressure unless it's really cold weather, where typically it's not a problem. The other thing is, in modern automobiles, the fuel pumps are right in the tank or right underneath the tank. So under no circumstances is the fuel ever under suction. There's head pressure to the pumps, and then the pumps are pressurized all the way to the fuel rail. It reminds me, I gotta silence my phone. Sorry. And to burn really clean. To make matters even worse, there's a winter blend and a summer blend fuel. The summer blend fuel actually works reasonably well in a lot of airplanes. The winter blend fuel can be a real problem, because the winter blend fuel is much more volatile than the summer blend fuel. And again, summer blend fuel is already more volatile than aviation fuel, either Swift or 100 LL. But the winter blend fuel is like twice as volatile. It's very, very volatile. I kind of relate it to, if you use liquid propane, a lot of you have a gas grill, and you've got liquid propane in that gas grill. As long as that liquid propane stays under some pressure in that tank, it stays liquid. As soon as you take the pressure off, it turns into the gaseous state, and of course that's what you use in your grill. Winter blend auto gas isn't far from that. I mean, it will stay liquid, but boy, it wants to turn into the gaseous state. So the problem is, if you have winter blend auto gas, which was designed to be very volatile so that it will vaporize in cold weather easier for cold weather starting and clean operation of cars, and you happen to get to an 80-degree day with that, I mean, we have a lot of problems in airplanes that are running winter blend auto gas. The switch is sometime in April, so mid this month, around the 15th, they start switching over. Yes, sir?
I'm not a fuel expert, but I've been led to believe the difference between winter blend and summer blend has to do with ethanol.
No.
That's what I've been told.
No, it's still got the same amount of ethanol in it. If it says 10%, it's 10%.
But the point is, if you fly the ethanol free, then I've been led to believe that there's not a difference between summer blend.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that it still meets modern emissions, which means I think they still have to put out a winter blend. Now, the marine fuel that's like 89 or 90, that may not be subject to the same emission standards, but I know typical winter blend fuel is, we have problems with it. A lot of planes, especially low wings, and especially airplanes that have the rear tank. And sir, it really doesn't matter whether they do it with ethanol or not. The point is they do it, and if you have winter blend fuel and you get to 80 degrees, you're likely to get vapor lock. So a lot of the planes that fly high with the 915s and 916s, they end up losing power when they go above 10,000 feet with winter blend auto gas. And again, it's because it's vapor locking on them. So just got to be real careful with that. Low wing airplanes, specifically like the carbureted RV12s, for example, a lot of the sport cruisers, the RV12s kind of suffer a little more than some others because the fuel tank is in the cargo bay, and the cargo bay heats up if you have the canopy closed, and if you get an 80-degree day, the fuel is going to be 80, it might be 100 back there inside the canopy. And then when you take off, you're bringing the fuel from back behind you up to the engine in a climb, you can get vapor lock. So the carbureted RV12s, you have to be real careful with the winter blend. Not a problem with the summer blend, but the winter blend fuel and a lot of the other low wings. And some of the high wings, like the Savannahs, for example, they have, a lot of those have a header tank down low. So even though you got wing tanks, you're drawing from the header tank in the back of the fuselage, and you can also run into vapor lock issues. Pressure at 100 degrees Fahrenheit is up at 11.5 to 13.5 psi. So just, it's a lot higher, a lot more likely to want to turn into the gaseous state, which September 16th and then in the spring around beginning of April, they're switching back. Even in Florida, it's everywhere. Yeah, it's strange. They just blend it for the whole country. They don't do different blends for different parts of the country. But we probably don't even need it down here, but it will be too difficult for them to blend the different fuels for different parts of the country. And the fuel evaporated off, which it does, and left some of the heavier content of the fuel, which ends up being gummy tar. And you can see the main jet's all gummed up. The jets that are usually affected the most by autogas, if it's stale, is the idle jet, which is right here in the center of the carburetor, down in that little tunnel, the main jet, and then the air screw. So those are the three things. If you have some auto gas that's sat too long and it gets skunky, those are the three jets that would need to be cleaned if you can save it without tearing it apart and overhauling it. I've got 120 knots true airspeed, and I am burning 3.8 gallons an hour. So that's the kind of efficiency that you can get with the fuel-injected Rotax engines, because that engine is running lean a peak, and the computer is doing it all for me. So pretty slick. Most automobiles have oxygen sensors, and so the computer is constantly looking at the mixture, and it can adjust it on the fly based on reality. If you're using leaded avgas, you can't use an oxygen sensor because the lead will ruin it. So you pretty much have to pre-map everything. Rotax is set up for oxygen sensors. Once there is a complete replacement of 100LL, they can add that and get even more tuning into their system. But at the moment, they spent thousands and thousands of hours and God knows how much money pre-mapping every possible altitude, RPM, temperature. I mean, I've seen the log files. It's unbelievable how many different checks they have. And that computer knows for any combination you throw at it, what the best mixture is, how to be rich a peak, how to be lean a peak, does it all automatically. It really is an impossible engine. I mean, this engine, it's the displacement of a 912 IS, 912 ULS, which is a 100 horsepower engine. They are boosting it to 160 horsepower. It can run at 135 horsepower, 137 on the 916, continuous output. And just to put that in perspective, a 180 horse engine running at 75% power is going to produce 135 horsepower. This engine can produce 137 continuously. So it can cruise like 180 horse. Takeoff power, max takeoff power 160, 2,000 hour TBO, And all the engines that we're selling in the US come with a 5-year, 2,000-hour warranty from the factory. So they are really standing behind this engine. They're very sure that it's gonna last. I've been operating one in a RV12. We've developed a firewall forward package, RV9. I'm sorry, for the RV9, and the performance we're getting is just nothing short of amazing. We can do 190 knots on 8.5 gallons an hour with that airplane at altitude. And again, it runs lean to peak automatically, so there's no mixture control. We were out west in Telluride. If you go to our website, RV916.com, you will see some of these, some of the comparisons we did with a regular RV9 with a 0320 in it, and it's just a whole different airplane. It's a completely different airplane. Yes, sir. They actually came to us and asked us to do it. So they approached us and said, "Hey, we think the 9 would be perfect with this engine, and we don't have the bandwidth to do it right now. Would you be willing to do it?" And so they've supported us. We use their test pilot for all the spin testing. That airplane that's here on the field is their airplane. They loaned it to us to do the testing, and we've been working with their engineers and working with Rotax to get it all done, because it's been quite a job to do it right. The first iteration, we had stability issues. We had to totally redesign it, and so that's the second generation, and we got it right. It really flies. You can't tell that it's got that engine out there, except it's smoother and it's quieter on the outside. It's about 80 pounds lighter. So that airplane that's in the main display area, it weighs about 995 pounds, and it's 1750 max gross. So we have a 750 pound useful load, which is amazing. And we put the engine where it needs to be, so we have good CG situation. And I've found that I can maintain max continuous power up to 19,000 feet. So I can just be blasting along and still have full cruise power up to 19,000 feet. Max operating altitude is 23,000, turbocharged, fuel injected. Computer control lean at mixture is automatic in eco mode, and 2,000-hour TBO. You're welcome to go to our website anytime at lockwood.aero. Raise your hand if you remember what the max EGT is on a 912 IS. Anybody remember that? No, you're in the ballpark. Anybody else? Who said 1742? Ah, all right. I win a hat.
Is this brief available for download?
Is what?
Available for download?
This lady's been recording it. You might talk to her, see if her website has it.
Hi, Phil. Great presentation. I have one more question to ask. So it seems like a Rotax engine slowly makes the way to general aviation. Do you think it will change people's opinion, Rotax engine, just for larger aircraft?
Well, yes, as they produce larger engines, you're seeing them move into bigger airplanes and certified airplanes. Tecnam, for example, is building a plane called the P Mentor, which is a standard category, fully certified airplane using the 912 IS engine. And with the advent of the new 916 at 160 horsepower, you're seeing that go in 4-seat airplanes like the Sling TSI.